Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
Maybe mend some fences between this government and the incoming presidency of Donald Trump's, given that the whole of his cabinet have been so rude about him over the last few years.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to see the honourable member making a rare appearance back here in Britain. He spent so much time in America recently. I was half expecting to see him on the immigration statistics when we see the next batch. But he may have missed. I did congratulate the incoming president last week.
Welcome to Quiet Riot, the blue sky to their X, the antidote to your poison, the port in any storm. I'm Naomi Smith.
And I'm Alex Andreu. We survived our first filmed session last week and have been overwhelmed by the supportive feedback from you, our glorious listeners. Thank you so much. You are too kind.
We never, ever fail to be grateful to the many thousands of you who tune in each week, and especially so to those who back us financially and get involved with our Discord channel exclusively for Quiet Riot Ko-Fi supporters.
The best things in life are free, just like this podcast, but the inputs cost money, so we couldn't do this without you. So you deserve to recline that chair, melt it to your headphones, and help us start another Quiet Riot.
Quiet Riot.
Welcome to Quiet Riot. I'm Alex.
And I'm Naomi. And boy, oh boy, has there been a lot happening since our Sunday school show. From COP29, laws reform, Justin Welby's resignation, Gary Lineker, Gary Barlow's giant son, to changes in the NHS, and of course, Trump's appointments. Each topic could fill an entire show.
We'll try to pull in as many of those threads as we can, and as ever, bringing you plenty of calls to action. Adding ballast to the good ship Quiet Riot, we have someone that feels very much like part of the gang now.
Indeed, it's me, Luke Tryl. Delighted to be back on the show to help these two unpack the week's news and to bring you some of the latest findings from the work of my organisation, More in Common.
We are also bringing back 3 of our regular features to lighten the load. And in honour of COP29, there will be a climate change theme running through them.
So without further ado, let's get cracking on a bumper show.
Hi, I'm here too.
Hello, Kenny.
Hi, Kenny. The annual climate conference this year is taking place in Baku, a city built off the back of fossil fuel profits. Yes, it's COP time, or Conference of the Parties. Bet you didn't know that. But what do the great British public think about climate change and policies to tackle it? I'm glad you asked, because it's time to bring back our first regular feature, Paul the other one. Luke, More in Common tracks voter sentiment on this issue. Tell us all.
Well, the first thing that I'll say, when it comes to climate change and public opinion on it, Britain isn't the US. The US is quite polarised on climate change. The UK really isn't polarised. So when we asked recently, would you like to see the government move faster to reach net zero, move at the same pace, or move slower, 41% said faster, 41% said the same pace, and just 18% said they wanted to see the UK move slower. And what's really interesting is even amongst the most conservative groups in the population, support for moving slower, for slowing down our climate ambition, doesn't get above a quarter. We also did what's known, and listeners will know, what's known as an MRP, where you look at constituency level concern about particular issues. And the really interesting thing is there is no constituency in the UK where concern about climate falls below 50%. The lowest in England is Telford at 54%. Interestingly, Clacton, parliamentary seat of Nigel Farage, 68% of people there say they are concerned about climate change. So, it's not just an issue that sometimes likes to be painted as just for the metropolitan elite. Right around the country, places like Blythe in the Red Wall, 63% say that they are concerned. So very definitely an issue of big concern that the public either think we're on the right track or want to see us moving faster. And the really interesting is we did some polling after the general election about, remember, was it this time last year? It was roughly around that when Sunak did his climate U-turns, when he said he was going to slow down some of the targets. Interestingly, we asked after the election about some of the things Sunak did well, some of the things he did badly. And the public were twice as likely to say that slowing down on those climate targets was one of Sunak's biggest mistakes than one of his successors. So there's real appetite to do this. And the final thing that I'll just say is that the argument that renewables are the safest path forward from an energy security perspective has been won. I have people in focus groups all the time saying we can't be dependent on madmen like Putin anymore for our energy. But also people think that long run, that renewables and clean energy is going to be the path to cheaper, more stable bills, avoiding some of those spikes that we see. So I sometimes think the press and some of politics is kind of stuck in 1997 on public attitudes to climate, when actually, if you look at the data, you look at the focus groups, the public are ahead of politicians in lots of ways.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like, for example, the Parliamentary Conservative Party reflects that sort of 80-20 blend, does it?
No, not at all. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that the Conservatives could make is putting themselves on the wrong side of public opinion on climate change. I actually think climate change is getting to the position where it's sort of becoming like a hygiene test, right? We expect our politicians to take it seriously. And the other interesting thing is, because, some people will say, well, the Conservatives will be worried about reform voters. And the truth is, reform voters are a bit more sceptical. But I would just add 2 points that on things like Great British Energy, reform voters, almost 60% of them think that it's a good idea. But the second thing is that even if they are more sceptical, it's not an issue that drives their vote. We know reform voters, overwhelmingly, immigration is the issue that they're voting on. Climate and environment is down under 10% as a motivator. And we even tried an experiment where we pitched to reform voters, half of them, Nigel Farage says we should go slower to reach net zero, half Nigel Farage says we should go faster. And actually, it flipped support quite dramatically doing that, because on an issue that is not central to Reform UK voters' identity, Nigel Farage's personal views have a lot more influence.
That's interesting.
I think Richard Tice drives a Tesla.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's an amazing little tidbit of information.
Well, there we go. That's what I'm here for. I'm here all week.
Fascinating stuff. Thanks, Lou.
Thank you.
Now, the new Labour government may have had a shaky start in terms of comms, but bloody hell they have been cracking on with their legislative programme. In many ways, it makes the inept comms even more frustrating. Whatever you think of it, from energy and renters' rights to employment and railways, no fewer than 24 pieces of legislation have been introduced, with a dozen more in consultation. Considering how few sitting days we've had since the election, that really is quite remarkable. The latest is looking at doing away with hereditary peers in the House of Lords. This is but the first step in wider Lords reform, the government says. Cynics suspect it might just be the lowest hanging fruit, with the rest of Gordon Brown's proposals being kicked into the long grass. The move has been condemned by some as going too far and others for not going far enough.
Plus ça change.
Yeah. Lord Roberts in the Mail caught my eye. He quotes Edmund Burke's Society is a Contract Between the Living and the Dead, and argues that, and I quote, hereditary peers represent the dead element of that contract. This is an argument for hereditary peers, let me remind you.
Oh my God. Okay.
The ancestors whose often glorious deeds made Britain the great country she is today, through their descendants, the House of Lords is populated by the shades and spirits of the greatest Britain.
Jesus fuck.
Thoughts?
Okay, I've got to come in. Sorry, Luke. Political power is never something that should be inherited. You would not accept a hereditary nurse, a hereditary lawyer. Why would we select a hereditary legislator? And I think being drawn from a pretty small group of aristocratic families and whittled down by archaic inheritance rules means that the hereditary peers are nothing like the people who have to follow the laws that they vote on. And at the moment, all the hereditary peers are men, they're all white, and due to male primogeniture, we have essentially reserved seats for men in our parliament. And when we look at the House of Lords, they've only reached 29% representation of women from among the appointed peers, far lower than places like Australia and Mexico, second chambers, which are, I hasten to add, directly elected, and they have both achieved parity. So there is no case at all for the hereditary peers. But my God, there is also no place for the current constitution of the House of Lords, and it does need bigger reform than just that.
Jenny Jones, on the other side of the argument, says this will make the House of Lords even less democratic, because actually among hereditary peers, there is a sort of election of a small number of them.
But the only electorate are the other fucking hereditaries.
No, I understand that. But what she says is that if you do away with those, then all that is left in the House of Lords is political appointees. That is a decent argument, isn't it?
Around 30% of peers were politicians before they entered the Lords. The majority of them are former MPs. About 8% of them are former political staff or held very senior positions within political parties. And to elect them would be no barrier to expertise. And at the moment, we just have the worst of both worlds. We've got these sort of part-time experts who rarely attend. I'm looking at the crossbenchers there. And then the full-time peers who only have experience from Parliament.
I think the hereditaries are, in a modern democracy, it seems to me totally indefensible to have them. And again, when we polled about this, I think it was just 8% of the public said they opposed getting rid of hereditary peers. I am less convinced about us having a second elected tier for also-rans to the House of Commons, which is what it would end up being, right? The people who weren't quite good enough to get into the Commons would end up there. And you would lose, I think there's something about having former ministers in there who've got expertise and, people who've come from the charity sector who never put themselves up for the horror show, which is election. But by being there, they make legislation much better. So I think the hereditaries is one thing.
Do they? Does the second chamber do what we want it to do? How much does it actually revise? Very little, Luke. I don't think it does all of those things that the people who defend an appointed chamber want it to be doing. I don't think it is working in that way, especially when you've got such a huge majority in the Commons and very little appetite in the Lords for much of a ping pong, even when there is a smaller majority in the Commons. I don't think they are doing a sufficiently effective check and balance on the House of Commons.
I feel I must channel the spirit of Ian Dunt in this conversation and say that during the Brexit episode, it was in large parts the Lords that resisted quite a lot of the more extreme things that government was trying to push through. Is that not some indication that...
Well, we have a very, very hard Brexit that isn't working for British business, for British people, and certainly is acting as a brake on economic growth. So whether they tinkered at the seams of the retained EU law bill or not, I think is largely neither here or there. Listen, I am genuinely embarrassed by our second chamber, so forgive me the rant. They are too old, they are too rich, they are too bloated in number, they are too male, they are too white, and they are too much there through patronage and far too over-representative of the southeast of England. And thanks to the bishops, too over-representative of one sect, of one religion, which in and of itself should have no place in policy making. The majority of our parliament is unelected. In the mother of all parliaments, one of the great democracies of the world, the vast majority of it is not democratically elected. We have 650 MPs and we have over 800 lords, not one of which is elected. No other country has such a bloated second chamber. France manages on about 350 members, Spain about 265. India, population of over 1 billion people, and Japan have just 245 members each. Only China's is bigger, and they're just there to rubber stamp what the Communist Party government of the day is doing. 35% of them live in London and the South East, and there are none who are registered as living in the North East, Wales, or the West Midlands. Average age is 70. And I just think that a fully elected House with real diversity, elected on maybe a different cycle to the House of Commons, maybe under a different voting system, just would make for better scrutiny and lawmaking.
All right. Let me pull you back, though, to the topic, because what you're doing is making a really cogent argument for much broader reform of the House of Lords. Do you think this measure, which is doing away with hereditary peers, do you think it is a good first step towards that? Or do you think it is actually a fob that takes us further away from wider Lords reform?
Well, by removing 92 hereditary peers in one fell swoop, we'll reduce the size by about 10%. Good. Definitely needs to happen. Okay. And it would bring it into line with comparable European chambers.
What do you think, Luke?
I think it is the most indefensible part of it, and I think it is sensible to do it. I rather suspect the compromise that will end up happening is that there are, on the Conservative side, 10 or so hereditary peers who are actually very active members who take part in the House of Lords. I think one of them has been leader of the House of Lords. So I suspect they will convert some of them ultimately in a compromise to life peers.
Yeah.
And I don't disagree with Naomi about reducing the size, although some of the other proposals which have come forward, for instance, about a mandatory age cap, well, you'd lose people like Alf Dubs, who are some of the most energetic and important members of the House of Lords. So how you do it, I think, is really important.
Can I ask you something else, Luke? How do people reconcile their rejection of hereditary peers with love of the monarchy? Because that as a foreigner, I find that always quite a strange one.
It's a really good question. I think, it goes back to what Naomi was saying, in that the House of Lords is part of the legislature, there to make and guide laws, whereas people see the role of the monarch as being purely ceremonial. We can argue the extent to which that is true, and people like that ceremonial role. And interesting, you've got to remember as well, most people don't like politics. And so the idea of politicizing the head of state, which in one way or another, an appointed method, an election method, would lead to that. You're even seeing it with the Chancellor of the University of Oxford elections at the moment, splitting into left and right. People would rather that it was something that was removed from politics. And so in that way, the hereditary principle works for them.
Quiet. The new Apple Watch Series 10 is here. It has the biggest display ever. It's also the thinnest Apple Watch ever, making it even more comfortable on your wrist. And it's the fastest charging Apple Watch, getting you 8 hours of charge in just 15 minutes. Introducing the all-new Apple Watch Series 10, now available for the first time in glossy jet black aluminum. Compared to previous generation, iPhone XS or later required. Charge time and actual results will vary.
Let's touch on Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury's resignation. It has rather added fuel to an amendment from the Conservative side, from Williamson. Strange times we live in, I think, to abolish bishops sitting in the House of Lords. Labour seem unwilling. What sits behind this? I think it is a reversal of traditional support. Is it pure politics that the church has been quite a thorn in the government's side these last few years on austerity and migrant rights and things like that? Or is there some more lofty reason behind it?
Firstly, on Welby himself, he should have gone the day the report was published. I think it was totally inconceivable, given what the report found, that he felt he could stay on. There's some suggestion Gavin Williamson might actually be doing this out of mischief. He wants to make Labour have some difficult votes on keeping bishops. But I think more broadly what you're seeing, and you're seeing this on the right across the world, is traditionally, of course, being conservatives, the right was about preservation of institutions. actually, increasingly, you are seeing around the world the right defining itself against those institutions. I mean, obviously, the US is the biggest example where, the institutions are the swamp. They need to be swept away. Elon Musk is going to cut the federal government by 120% or whatever it is, and it's a really interesting reversal in tension. And what it's doing on the flip side then is forcing parties of the centre left who were, traditionally more radical about social progress into defenders of institutions and the status quo. So I think it's such an interesting dynamic, which warrants, I think, a lot more study.
There is almost certainly something in it with Williamson trying to cause trouble for the Starmer government. But I wholeheartedly endorse his message. And, strange bedfellows indeed to find Naomi Smith and Gavin Williamson agreeing with one another on the Lord's spiritual. And Alex, you mentioned at the top of this section, the wholesale constitutional reform that reformists are after. Don't see any one part of this in isolation. And many of us who want, a written constitution all in one place and who would really like to see a secular democracy with a total separation of church and state. You can't want for some of it and not accept how intertwined each of them is and how we need voting reform and constitutional reform hand in hand together. And when we come to the Lord's spiritual and the whole debacle that the Church of England finds itself in over historic abuses, we know where there are concentrations of power, abuse can flourish. It really speaks to that point of why are we allowing one sect of one religion there? Well, because our head of state is also the head of the established church, and so they get to have their men in dresses in Parliament making laws. And I just think in 2024, in a multi-ethnic, diverse, modern society, that is not what people expect of their democracy. They don't see it delivering for them. And so they do want to have a look at how things should and could be done far better.
It is clear that they had not thought through the impact of the budget. And this is the problem with having a copy and paste chancellor.
We have put more money into local authorities than they did in 14 years. They left them in an absolutely catastrophic state. We produced a budget which does not increase tax on working people, nothing in the payslip. Investing in our NHS, investing in our schools so every child can go as far as their talent will take them, investing in the houses of the future. If she's against those things, she should say so.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not against any of those things. But, of course not. None of us are against any of those things. But he has confirmed that he does not know what is going on.
So let me get this straight, Mr. Speaker. She doesn't want any of the measures in the budget, but she wants all the benefits. So the magic money tree is back after 2 weeks in office. 2 weeks in office. They've learned absolutely nothing.
Before we leave domestic politics, I wanted to ask you something, Luke. I'm conscious we got your first impression on the day Kemi Badenoch won the leadership contest. Wednesday was her second PMQ. So what is your more considered impression, I guess, your second impression of her?
Well, I guess a couple of things. I can firstly give you the sort of public's initial impression as well. We now have some polling back. So we have the first voting intention that we've done since Kemi Badenoch became leader has the Conservatives on 29%, Labour on 27%, so a lead of 2 points for the Conservatives. That's not unusual for new opposition leaders to get
a bump,
somewhat of a bounce. And the Conservatives still well below what many people assumed was their floor of 30%. And then on approvals, Keir Starmer has ticked back up a bit. He's on minus 25, and Kemi Badenoch starts at minus 3. So higher than Keir Starmer, but again, not particularly high for someone newly elected, and lots of people saying they don't yet know and they aren't that familiar with her. I think it's hard for any new politician or any politician at all to have positive approval ratings in the current climate, but it'll be interesting to see if that minus 3 stays around there, which was roughly where Starmer was for lots of the last parliament, or it goes up or down. On PMQ specifically, I think it's probably fair to say this isn't her arena. And whether that matters, we all remember William Hague was brilliant at PMQs and it made no difference. Similarly, we know people like Donald Trump are terrible debaters and it doesn't seem to hurt them so much. But I think there's also a danger that Starmer could start to come across a little bit haughty in his responses to her as well. Whilst I think Kemi Badenoch's opening pitch, her acceptance speech was pretty good, and I think a lot of what she said in her first interview on the Sunday with Koonsberg was quite good. I think one of the more dangerous lines was when she implied that Partygate was overblown. And again, I think that speaks to the Conservatives haven't yet decided, do we defend the record or do we move away from it? There's got to be something to signify a break with the past.
I'd love to talk very briefly, if we've got time, not about the appointments that Badenoch has made, but Starmer's, and two in particular. One is an appointment declined in the form of Sue Gray, and the other is an appointment hoped for, like no one has ever hoped for an appointment before, and that's Lord Mandelson as US AMBO. What do you both read into Sue Gray after a period of time off not accepting Starmer's offer to be envoy for the regions and nations?
I mean, look, I can sort of understand why Sue Gray's decided to step away. I find some of the briefing about Sue Gray now a little distasteful. I felt after she left, some of the, she was so terrible was a bit much and unnecessary. And then I think even the briefing yesterday about did she refuse the job or was she pushed was just a bit unpleasant and unseemly. And
I couldn't agree more, Luke.
And look, I don't think this stuff cuts through that much, but I just think I don't like it. And the other thing, then this is a danger for Starmer, is it reinforces that boys club thing. It's the boys trashing a senior woman. So I think he should stamp it out.
I don't know her at all, but I do know people that do know her very well. And they've told me that what they read in the briefings against her were unrecognizable from the woman they have worked with and have known for many decades. That, she is an incredibly considered, diligent, hardworking, loyal person.
Yeah.
And I do lay blame for it at Starmer's door, because when he made the appointment initially to put her in the post of Chief of Staff, I did think, wow, you have just given the most political job in the country to somebody who has made a virtue of not having a political career. And I always thought that he was, really creating a lose-lose situation for her, and it would be almost impossible to win. Quickly on Mandelson then, I've got a couple of things that I just want to point out to listeners, because I was a bit anxious this morning, we record on a Wednesday, that he was talking about cakeism and the idea that the UK can have the best of both worlds by pursuing both trade with America and consecutively with the EU. And I think that is quite a historically dangerous message. Cakeism from the Conservatives is what caused Brexit. It told people that the German car industry wouldn't allow trade barriers between the UK and the EU. We got them. It told them we could keep British waters empty of EU trawlers. We've got them, etc. And we've sort of seen with grim detail how that has played out. Of course, we must work with the US where we can. We should first ask if the Trump administration is a basket that we want to put our eggs in when we do have the option of putting them elsewhere. I just think that there is a trap here for the UK government. They either get strung along just enough to keep us making meaningful progress on the trade deal that really matters with the EU. That review, of course, is coming up within the next year or so. Or they do a kind of thin Australia-style trade deal with the US that will deliver very little economic benefit to the UK, but will prevent us from removing trade barriers with the EU. So, listeners, if you agree with that and you think we really ought to be making sure we prioritise our trade deal with our nearest trading partners, and you have a Labour MP, write and tell them.
The flip side of that, I guess, is that if you see the UK ambassador to the US's position as requiring a shrewd reader of the way the wind is blowing, and a sort of power broker, then Mandelson is good at that stuff, right? I think everyone is trying to calibrate right now how they deal with another 4 years of Donald Trump in the White House. So I think a lot of what's going on is testing and noise, and we'd be better off letting the situation settle a tiny bit.
And isn't it all also bound up in, what is going to be the bigger and more immediate discussion about security, right? And which way do we turn? Because if Europe finds that it has to become more independent from America in military terms, and we're the same, surely that is in of itself going to draw us more into Europe's orbit, regardless of what we're saying about trade. If we need to work with Europe to protect ourselves, that seems like the more immediate challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the points you're both making. I'm just saying that even when inside the EU, the UK's role has been a little bit of a bridge, almost translating America to Europe and translating Europe to America. And there is a way for that role to still be performed when we're outside the EU. And actually, that would bring us closer to the EU. It would be something we could offer the EU, that kind of mediator role. So I don't know how it will work because, we're dealing with someone who is mercurial, unreliable, unpredictable, and will get up every morning and tweet or truth whatever pops into his head. So it's very difficult to predict the landscape in that situation, but I'm just saying the possibility is there.
Quiet Riot. Expecting the Express, the Daily Mail, and even the Telegraph to ditch their labelling of anything and everything that annoys them as being woke would basically be akin to expecting the sun not to rise in the east. So back after a short hiatus, here's a new WOKEY DOKEY.
WOKEY DOKEY.
Alex, what have you found?
So today's piece is both environmentally and US flavoured to act as a segue to our next topic.
Let's see what you've done there.
And it comes courtesy of Paul Mulshine, a columnist for the New Jersey Star Ledger, who describes himself as the most insightful, spelled INCITE, conservative columnist at a major American newspaper. Okay, then. The piece is titled, "The Woke Attitude on Energy is Gone with the Wind." Consider this quote on climate policy from Massachusetts Senator Ed Markey. He writes, "It's time for us to stop talking about what is politically feasible and start talking about what is scientifically necessary. We cannot compromise on science." This is offered not in praise, but in condemnation. It is the US equivalent, basically, of people have had enough of experts. He says it's an affront to democracy for Markey to say that the views of the public should be discounted if they clash with the views of whatever scientists are cherry-picked by a politician. It's a decent school of thought. I don't subscribe to it, but it is something that is internally consistent. He then, however, cherry-picks Bob Stern, whom he describes as an actual scientist with a PhD, as
Ooh,
if,
whole PhD, wow.
No, in support of scrapping a scheme to generate offshore wind power for New Jersey, despite acknowledging polling that shows New Jersey residents are 54% in favour and only 40% against the scheme. I just thought there was a magnificent elegance doing precisely what he accused the Democrats of doing at the start of a piece, as in cherry-picking a scientist and saying, forget about what the people want, this is the guy we should listen to. For a 600-word piece, it's kind of amazing to make that jump from the first to the 7th paragraph. So that's my wakey dokey for today. Science is woke and climate change is woke.
Thank you, Alex.
You're welcome.
Quiet Riot.
Hey, it's me, the Quenchies. I'm that late afternoon craving you just can't shake. Wait, what's that? Welch's Grape Aid? No! Made with real fruit and no added sugar, nothing answers the call of the Quenchies like Grape Aid. Got the Quenchies? Grab a Grape Aid in your juice aisle.
On Sunday, Alex and I talked a little about how happy men, some extremely happy, are, and particularly men under 50, about Trump's victory. And we touched on the problem of us just not understanding well enough the informational space that Trump voters occupy. It is extremely annoying that people who feel poor are supporting Musk, who is wealthier than the GDP of Hungary and getting wealthier by the minute if you look at his stocks. And of course, the insanely wealthy Donald Trump. And the feedback we had from our listeners after the Sunday school show was that they too want to understand it all a bit better. So in this next section, we're going to dig deeper into it, and not least because Luke has definitely been doing some excellent digging on it all. But allow me to frame this, verbally process where my head has been at over the last few days on it. And it seems to me that the entire English-speaking world's youth are engaging with content that none of us want to. And why don't we want to? Because a lot of it is very long-form drivel. I mean, I will not inflict on you the number of dreadful Twitch bits of content I've been watching over the last couple of days. But the right is prepared to hoover all of that stuff up, to analyse the comments, to understand what people are talking about. And so on the progressive side, I'd say that we really have no choice. The right deeply understands this very new fragmented media landscape, especially so in the US, but to an increasing extent here in the UK too. And the UK, as usual, is kind of behind the US on all of this. But I think there is now a chance for UK politicos and campaigners to change course if they get it quickly. I think there is just enough time for the UK to act to stop populism gaining traction even more so ahead of the next election. But as of now, most progressives don't even know it exists. This new media that they focus on, like short form TikTok, just simply isn't where political information is mostly being consumed. And it needs to be like a sideshow to the long form. Anyone who said long form is dying were actually mistaken. It's these highly produced long form that has died. But long form that is unscripted, unedited, is the fastest growing entertainment news medium in the world. And the problem we have is that all of the things like that or political podcasts like ours are being made by busy people who can only do a couple of hours of podcasting a week. These channels do like 4-hour-long episodes, and often they're young people who have made it their job to do it, or, you know, they're kind of grifters with no day job. So they're just endlessly kind of spouting populist rhetoric on their streams. And I would qualify it with saying something like Fox News is highly compatible with this long form. So there is a cohesive media mix there that the likes of CNN and NBC are completely detached from. As I said, these long form shows are happening on Twitch, YouTube, podcasts, to a lesser extent, Instagram, but they are a bit there too. And they are huge. I'm going to mention a guy who you've probably never heard of, Adin Ross, A-D-I-N Ross. He uses the N-word with abandon on his streams, and he has 4.5 million subscribers on YouTube. So that's kind of what I know, which isn't much, but I think it's more than I perhaps realized a couple of months ago. And certainly I've been trying to get to grips with it more since Trump's victory. And Luke, I really want to bring you in here because you've been looking at all of this in a bit more detail, and there's a lot in there around like cross-pressured voters. They might have conservative views on some issues, progressive views on others. How is this kind of informational space shaping the current political and voting landscape here in the UK?
It's a really key question. I think this is perhaps the most important thing for people to grapple with in the wake of what happened in the US. I mean, the first thing to say is, you look at it, most voters are cross-pressured. It is weird that people align ideologically one way on every issue. And that is particularly the case in the UK. I often say British voters are wonderfully inconsistent, but people who are politically engaged find that quite hard to reconcile, because people who are politically engaged tend to be, I am of the left and therefore that affects my views on climate, on migration, on criminal justice, the economy. Similarly on the right, the alternative of that. I think the difference, though, in how the left and right approach it is the right are much more willing to say it's an issue like Brexit or immigration. Look, you agree with me on that. Come and campaign with me on that. You can be in the tent. It doesn't matter that I think you're a total pinko on climate change or something else. Come with me. I think the left, and I say this, as someone who sort of comes from the right, but now spends a lot of time working with progressive organizations, understanding public opinion. Some on the left make it much harder to be part of the club because they say, unless you align with all of these issues, I don't care that you support the particular one I'm campaigning on. So, it might be that you are, let's stick with climate, and they say, but you've also got to be very pro-Gaza, you've also got to be very pro-trans rights, you've also got to be very pro-migrant.
Yeah.
Exactly. And all of those things might be, good and worthy things. But the problem is what you're essentially doing is, if you think about it like a Venn diagram, the group that overlaps on all of those issues is far smaller than the group who might support you on climate writ large. So one of the challenges I've been trying to make to progressives this week is, can you build a more inclusive form of progressivism by sort of taking people as they are, not compromising on your values, but saying, look, we're a climate campaign organization. We want people who want to make progress on climate, and the other issues are slightly separate.
I think it's even slightly worse than that, Luke, because what I've noticed is there is a tendency to do negative vetting. So it's not only that you're required to agree on a broad range of issues, people will go out of their way to find like the one thing you've said that basically makes you entirely unpalatable in everything else.
Even if you said it 15 years ago.
Yeah, invalidates your entire career, everything you've said, all your opinions. You literally end up in a situation where no one is pure enough.
Luke, can I ask you, do you think maybe the only party that has successfully done what you sort of laid out there in the UK is the Green Party, who took 2 seats in rural communities directly from the Conservatives and 2 seats fending off Labour in urban environments? And you might imagine that their electors had very little in common with each other, but were perhaps united around the climate commitment of the Green Party.
Well, exactly that. I think it's a really good example, because I think it points to what is a potential challenge for the Greens going forward, actually, is that their voters in Bristol Central are very different to their voters in Waveney Valley on lots of issues that aren't climate and the environment. I would say, interestingly, I think probably, and this may go down badly with listeners, but I think the other politician who managed to get those cross-pressured voters was Boris Johnson in 2019, when you saw that really very broad Tory coalition, which spanned from the Red Wall, the more socially conservative voters, but who also wanted those new hospitals, through to more traditional, economically conservative, but maybe more socially liberal voters in the South as well. Clearly, that coalition was very difficult to maintain, and it ended up not delivering for either. Hence, you get Conservatives on 120 seats. But, it was, I think, more of an attempt to do that. And some of the thinkers in the Conservative Party will say that the future of the Conservative Party is to lean into that a bit more, be a bit more economically statist and a bit more socially conservative, because we all do those political compass things. That is where the bulk of the voters potentially are.
And it's interesting that we're doing an episode on Germany soon. There is a politician there, Sarah Wagenknecht, that is doing exactly that to the extreme. She's got almost communist policies economically on one side and exceptionally far-right policies on the other, to do with immigration and LGBT rights and things like that. And maybe that is actually a format, an emergent idea that will gain quite a lot of traction, I think.
Well, it's one of the reasons I think that Farage constantly puts a cap on the support for his parties, because he sort of gets it on the cultural issues, and particularly around immigration. He gets where his potential group of voters are. But actually, when you chat to informed voters or poll them, they're also the most anti-big business, the most in favour of abolishing the House of Lords, the most in favour of lockdown. So they lose them when they do the libertarian style stuff as well. So it would be interesting to see if a BSW style party could get traction in the UK.
We've talked quite a bit about the content and the policy positioning of this kind of new alignment. But I really do want to bring us back to the format. And when Alex and I were discussing, this long form drivel, and it is drivel, it is. I mean, I'm not going to deny that. I'm just saying it's important drivel that we need to understand better and be monitoring and potentially copying. And Alex, you made a really good point, didn't you, about it's not just online.
Because actually, if you look at Donald Trump rallies, that's the format. It's that unscripted 3 hours. I love the sound of my own voice, and I'm going to talk endlessly about nonsense, go on various tangents, but then always come back to sort of my talking points. And it strikes me that Donald Trump is kind of the grandfather of those manosphere 3-hour rambling podcasts.
I do a thing called a weave. Yeah. And there are those that are fair that say, this guy is so genius. And then others would say, oh, he rambled. I don't ramble. If I start a story, what you do is you weave things and you do it. You have to have certain things. You need an extraordinary memory because you have to come back to where you started.
Yes.
A weave is only good if you come back.
They don't give you credit for that. Yeah, it's true. You can go all the way over here and then get back.
I can go so far here or there. And I can come back to exactly where I started. Now, someday when you don't come back to where you started,
you're Biden.
Then you say, no, but the weave is the way.
I also had the realization that Johnson does that too. The stuff that seems unfocused and quite mad to us about the Trump rallies, if you go to his speech to the business community and the Peppa Pig stuff and all of that, we might find it a train wreck and unpalatable. But there is probably a generation of young men who are used to having something on in the background that they only occasionally tune into.
Exactly that, Alex. Yeah. It's the equivalent of radio for the 1940s and 1950s. The one thing that Trump and Johnson and all those long-form specialists understand, probably, is that entertainment is far more important to most people than politics is. And if you're hoping to get a message across, you need to entertain, you need to engage, and then you need to inform. Now, they've got entertainment and engagement nailed down. The key messages are of secondary importance. As we saw, Trump's campaign was, from a communications perspective, an absolute car crash, day in, day out, week in, week out, month in, month out. But at the end of the day, that made no difference because from an entertainment perspective, he'd already engaged with sufficient people.
Yes, but maybe not, Kenny, because when you say part of the mission should be to inform, then you're envisaging the passing of accurate information to the people listening. Disinformation has exactly the same mode of delivery. So if your mission is to entertain, engage, and disinform, actually the format of delivery would be exactly the same.
Absolutely agree. The point Alex makes is absolutely spot on. It doesn't make any difference what your key message is, whether it's truthful or not. It's where it sits in that sort of triumvirate of entertain, engage, and inform.
I have had the misfortune to consume some of this stuff, and one of the things that I've noticed is how much they borrow from a now age-old populist playbook. So some of these big YouTube accounts with millions of followers, and they'll get easily 1 million views within a couple of days on any long-form piece of content they put out, will interview Donald Trump one week and they will interview Bernie Sanders the next week. And then the comments is full of young people saying things like, well, these guys can't be biased. They must be telling us the truth. They haven't got an agenda because look, they're prepared to hear from the other side. And I wonder if this goes back to Luke's earlier point about the left being very puritanical about you're either with us or you're against us and you have to be with us on everything. What that says about big media outlets like The Guardian leaving a space like Twitter is that surrendering that sphere of influence solely to the outright. Do we have views on that?
I mean, I think it was a mistake of Kamala not to do Joe Rogan in the end, and not least because just to that point, it left open to the charge of why won't she do it when, Bernie has done it, he's of the left. And there is an opportunity to reach people and to reach audiences that are traditionally disengaged. And I guess one of my fears about the ex-Blue Sky exodus is that you're basically going to get left with X broadly being people on the right. You're going to get Blue Sky being people more on the left. So you've got even more of an echo chamber there, people not speaking to each other, but also missing out on opportunities to influence one another.
I don't agree with that, Luke, because I think it's a particular feature, of the left to look for calmer environments, but it's also a particular feature of the right to want to annoy people and trigger the libs and troll the libs, etc. There's Truth social network out there, and it's not doing anything in particular. If the right wants a space that belongs to it, it's there and they're not going to it. I genuinely believe that by removing the reaction to those hard right messages, you remove quite a lot of the pleasure that the amplifiers of that information take in putting it out there.
So perhaps what we're getting to is advice that while we don't have to engage with it wholesale, we do have to still maintain a watch on it to read these comments and see. I mean, you almost, sorry to tell you this, Luke, but you almost don't need to do focus groups when you've got this qualitative data in the comment section and you can scrape that and analyze, who is responding to what message over time and get a better understanding of the cut through of certain issues and framing devices with these voters that all parties are going to try and court ahead of the next election. Luke, while I've got you on this, and we're talking about the major platforms, can we also just talk a bit about algorithms and the extent to which they have fundamentally shaped the way political information is encountered by voters?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And there is no doubt, I was talking about echo chambers before, but the extent to which, on certain platforms, they become self-reinforcing. So, if you click on, I made the mistake of clicking on some alt-right stuff the other day, and now all I'm being shown is that on X. So it becomes self-reinforcing, and I'm sure, sort of similar on the left. Obviously, there's this sort of organic approach that algorithms take. There's then the more direct one that proprietors of social media companies can use, which is part of it. But I guess I've always said, and maybe this is more the nature of our work, that I think there's quite a lot of focus on that supply side of things like misinformation, disinformation, echo chambers, which I think is important, and we think about how we deal with it. But I'm almost more interested in the demand side. What is making people seek out that kind of, whether it's mis or disinformation, and why are they susceptible to it? Or that wanting to be sort of in a singular tribe and not exposed to competing points of view. And I suspect we could probably make more progress, even though it's harder, by focusing on that demand side, because the supply side is, I think, a bit like a sort of hydras. Is it hydras where you cut off their head and they grow back? Yeah, it ends up a bit like that. Whereas if we can get to the demand side, maybe we can tackle it more effectively.
Well, guys, clear your diaries, because we are going to have to start recording 8-hour-long episodes of Quiet Riot with immediate effect.
Listen, they all are 8-hour episodes. I have to edit them. To close the show, it's time for our last regular feature, where we grab hold of the life raft of a good news story.
Good news is welcome to me. Bad news is hell come to me. Good news. Donny-o-lo, donny-o-lo, donny-o-lo,
and how we need some good news right now. Naomi, I think we are sticking to the theme of environmental action. What have you got to cheer us up?
Well, slightly left field here. Despite Chinese President Xi Jinping not turning up to the COP summit this week, China has, in fact, been making substantial steps in developing and implementing green technology. And it now accounts for almost 40% of all investment into green energy and has placed climate action at the top of its agenda for national rejuvenation. Now, look, let's note, this is not entirely born out of charity and saving the planet. The country itself is particularly vulnerable to climate change. They've got about 650 million Chinese people living in coastal regions alongside their economic and manufacturing heartlands. But nevertheless, China has been going absolutely full throttle towards building a greener world. And given their increased economic and geopolitical might, they could be the only country really capable of solving such a complex and global issue. If we look at electric vehicles, 90% of global investment into EVs came from China in the 5 years to 2023. So there's a reason why both Musk and the EU are wary of cheap and effective Chinese EV imports. When we look at solar panels, about 8 in 10 solar panels are produced in China. And the country is focused on developing the capacity to double their production rate if needed. And their energy system, of course, is still using coal, but it is quickly moving towards wind and solar energy sources. And last year, the amount of energy from wind and solar that entered the Chinese energy system was 3 times as large as all the energy consumed in the UK. So they really see clean energy as an opportunity for GDP growth. You know, we know that the UK government sees it too and is fast trying to implement its own agenda there. And last year, clean energy innovation accounted for 40% of China's GDP growth, where Europe and Asia seem absolutely besotted by talking about climate action. China really is walking the walk. And let's not forget that China is an increasingly influential actor geopolitically. Obviously, there are concerns around debt traps and expansionism into Taiwan, but Chinese foreign policy is driven by the Belt and Road Initiative. The project, it's one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in human history, and they're present in over 150 countries currently. So China is leading, financing and building this project. And one of the most promising aspects of their focus on green tech is just how well placed the country is to encourage and maybe even force other countries around the world to adopt green tech that they have created. So in a new world of Trump Act 2, Scene 1, where the president-elect appoints a man enamored with fracking, taking America back out of the Paris climate agreements, China's proactive performance on green tech and their willingness to invest could well be good news for us all. The Economist has far more on this, and we'll leave a link in the show notes below so that you literally can grin and, most importantly, share it.
This last segment was sponsored by TikTok and Alibaba.
Not this week, but give it time.
Well, like all good things, we must end this week's show, and perhaps I need to end it with a zaijian. A huge thank you to Luke for joining us.
It's great to be back with you.
Promoted as well, of sorts. Naomi's off on Sunday. She's babysitting, which is lovely. And I've got Arthur Snell to do Sunday school with me because I thought there are so many global stories of conflict and how another Trump term in the White House will affect all of those. So we will do a special Sunday school on that topic. So look out for that.
And in the meantime, make sure to head over to ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod to sign up for a one-off donation or monthly membership if you can. And it'll mean you're the first to hear about editorial meetings, live shows, and more.
And if you want to follow us on social obstacles, then blue sky is the place where we are most flourishing at the moment. We have various starter packs that will connect you with loads of well-known journalists and politicians and campaigning organizations, as well as all of our contributors who are on Blue Sky. And we've also done 2 interviews on the structure and ambition of Blue Sky with the Chief of Operations, Rose Wang. So look out for those. Until then, keep quietly writing. Love you lots. See you next time.
Bye. Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith, Alex Andreu and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangita, artwork by Simona Canelu. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Soundstone Global.
Quiet Riot.
All right. Marvelous. And they don't seem to be drilling outside my window anymore, which is a
Hurrah.
bonus.
Da-da.
Right. Shall I go? Kenny, give me a countdown.
Sorry, Kenny, your chair is very creaky.
I'm going to switch off my microphone as soon as I give you the countdown.
Fine.
It's driving me mad here as well. Trip to the shops on Saturday.
Okay.
Right. Okay, in 3, 2, 1, live.
Don't put that in the edit.
Let's start again. In and out, in and out. In 3, 2, 1, live.